This video is sponsored by Enlisted. Welcome to the Boss Hall of Infamy from games that I, John Meshcat, have played. This means, before you get all upset and go,
Magican, you forgot about this boss from this game I played?
consider the fact that I probably haven't played it myself. Mostly the games I play that have notable bosses are Souls-likes, so expect a lot of those types of bosses. That being said, do let me know if you've encountered worse garbage than what I'm about to unveil here. So let's begin at number 10. Our first entry might not seem like the most offensively poorly designed thing in existence. I mean, how bad can a boss with only one mechanic be? Impressively though, Team Cherry found out you can still make a one-attack boss insufferable. All it does is spawn aggressively tracking little toothy babies. But whether this is a problem or not depends entirely on if you can kill them in one hit. And in a game that's as unlinear as they get, it's not a safe bet that everyone that reaches this point has the upgrades needed to do so. The little flukes have 13 hit points, and I think by this point in the game most players will have a sharpened nail, which does 9 damage per hit. So most likely you'll need 2 hits to kill them. And having the flukes live long enough for more to spawn while the previous ones are still alive makes for a messy, shitty fight. Even with a one-shotting weapon though, if you get 2 little flukes coming at you from 2 different angles at once, it can still lead into some bullshit moments. Along with that, I find this boss to be honestly nauseating and headache-inducing. The constant shaking of Fluke Marm and the lack of music leaving you alone with non-stop awful noise emanating from the boss just makes me want to stop the fight as quickly as possible. Though it is pretty funny how this thing has a credited voice actor. Can you imagine what recording this was like? Probably more fun than fighting it ever was. Originally I was going to include Team Ninja's latest practical joke, Zhang Rang from Wo Long, but since launch they have changed the fight enough to make it middle F tier instead of the original bottom F tier. So to replace him we are going with Nioh 2's greatest stud instead. Lady Osakabe is visually impeccable, mechanically repulsive, and a crime in combat design. When you make a fighter with 4 stationary targets firing at you at the same time, the issue you tend to run into is that when you're facing one of them, you can't see the rest. You'd think they had learned from Yatsuno Kami from the first game that suffers from the same issue, but no, they doubled down on it. This means the main challenge of the fight is off-screen projectiles hitting you before you can even react to them. And even if you can, you might not be able to act on it because you're stuck in an attack animation. And one would hope there would at least be a clear sound cue for these projectiles, so you can maybe kind of guess what's coming. But no, not really. And whatever there is, it's definitely not audible underneath all the other sound effects and music. I find this to be extremely luck-based. Sometimes I can walk up to a tentacle and decimate it with little resistance from the other 3, other times I get bombarded with 3 spells at once and die. And aside from looking at what's wrong with the fight, I find it impossible to find anything that's right with it. Other than the spectacle. There's just nothing fun going on here, just boring attacks made hard simply by you not being able to see them. But I hope they finally learned their lesson from this. Oh, right, they then made Zhang Rang. Lud and Zullen is kind of tricky to judge fairly. On its own, it's not the worst thing ever made, but you can't ignore the context. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about. But first, let's talk about just the fight itself. It's really bad. With one tiger already having terrible hitboxes and ridiculous damage output, that gets doubled when there's 2 of them. Bad luck can also dictate your fate, because if they do simultaneous attacks, it's sometimes legitimately impossible to avoid. Seriously, what is wrong with their damage? This is New Game, not New Game Plus, and I'm wearing heavy armor. But it is possible to rush one of the tigers down before the double becomes too much trouble, so on its own it would be just another forgettable bad gank fight. There's plenty of those in Dark Souls 2. But again, that context changes everything. That being Frigid Outskirts, the worst level ever designed in gaming history. And the fact that you have to go through it every single time you fight this boss, which takes me on average about 6 to 7 minutes. That is, if I can get there at all. Luck can again determine your chances of survival if instead of the usual 1 horse fuck spawning, you get 2, or even 3. I would usually say the quality of the level shouldn't be judged alongside the boss that resides in it, but in this case it's impossible to ignore. And with Lud and Zullen having ridiculous damage output for New Game, as well as having bullshit elements in place, it feels like it was designed to force you to run through Frigid Outskirts as many times as possible. So the boss and the level work together to create the least fun part of any game I've played in my life. And I keep having to do it for footage. Before we continue, I'd like to talk a little bit about Enlisted, which is free on consoles and PC. I was happy to be sponsored by them because I actually thought this game looked really fun. Obviously, I'm sponsored to talk about it, but I'm 100% honest there. I find World War II history fascinating, and this game lets you immerse yourself right into its battlefields and command squads of your own troops, and stick them on those of enemy players. So even when you don't have a billion players in the lobby, you can still have massive scale battles using real-world weaponry, vehicles, and outfits. It's especially cool to me how the vehicles work and don't just have a set amount of HP before they explode, and instead each individual component has its own stats. I think it makes fighting tanks and other vehicles a lot more realistic, and operating them more immersive. Since you're not only fighting players, you don't have to be an absolute PvP god to have fun in this game. That being said, it is war, so anyone can die at a moment's notice. But that's part of the experience. Also, as a little bonus, I was given a link that you guys can use to get a free bonus pack upon registering and logging in on PC, which you can find in the description or pinned comment. As for returning players, Enlisted was recently updated with stuff like research trees for weapons, vehicles, a matchmaker based on equipment, and other sorts of gameplay improvements. So now's the perfect time to go check out Enlisted for new and returning players. With that said, let's get back to the video. This pick is extremely niche, and I'd be surprised if anyone watching this has any idea what I'm talking about, so I'll do my best to paint a clear picture of what this shit is. So, the base game of Resident Evil 3 Remake has a final boss that's basically just an interactive cutscene, more or less. That being the final transformation stage of Nemesis. It's really simple, easy, and harmless. Cool thematically for sure. But the hardest difficulty mode for the game, Infernal, changes this fight completely. Now it spams attacks non-stop that are either one-shots or stun-lock you long enough for you to die even if you survive the initial hit. Infernal Final Stage Nemesis is one of the hardest, most frustrating fights I've ever encountered. Sure, I did sign up for the hardest mode of the game, but I still enjoyed it up until this point. What I really love about the challenge runs in Resident Evil 3 is how you can customize the difficulty. You can make it so you take less damage, do more damage, or regenerate health, and you can determine how much of each you want. But none of that matters for the Blob Nemesis because it just kills you in essentially one hit regardless. And it's just not a fun challenge. If you've been around the channel for longer, you'll know I'm all for challenges. But this is the wrong kind for me. The combos are repetitive, tedious, and it doesn't feel like it works for Resident Evil 3's combat. Flamethrower Nemesis is as far as you can push the gameplay. Blob Nemesis exceeds it. It's the equivalent of fighting a Sekiro boss in Dark Souls 2. This is the one boss I have never beaten, and I don't really care to. Obviously I could learn the fight, it's not that complicated, but I just don't enjoy it enough for that. I enjoyed doing the challenge run, I got to the final boss, and it's just not worth it anymore. For a lot of OG Demon Souls players, Dragon God was notorious for being a huge letdown for being the poster boy of the game, and a badass looking boss that's hyped up early in the game. I went into this knowing that the fight sucks, and I was still disappointed. I get the size of the boss was impossible to make work for a proper duel, but if stealth or a puzzle was the focus, they should have done it in a way that still made Dragon God showcase his powers and make it cool, make it cinematic. Instead he just stands there, looks around and punches you when you're spotted. That's just so boring and unimaginative, especially for a game that has plenty of creative bosses, even if mechanically they haven't aged all that well. But Dragon God is just a snooze fest that gets old the minute you start it. Not to mention the stealth itself is garbage and centers around waiting and guessing where he can see you and where he can't. When this thing has 8 eyeballs, 4 on each side, how the fuck would I know where he's looking? And guessing wrong means instant death. Yeah, fuck that. We have another bad gang fight, this time from the critically acclaimed Elden Ring, a game that is full of some of the best single target bosses of all time, and where every single gang fight sucks. The worst of them for me is Valiant Gargoyles. Now, the reason why we have so many multi-target bosses on this list is simple. It's not that I hate all gangs, there are some that are good, but in general what I hate the most are off-screen attacks and stuff you can't reliably avoid. And that type of stuff is more commonly seen in the bad kind of gang fights where you have overlapping combos that can't be fully avoided with bad RNG. In the early days of Elden Ring, I tried to justify the poor gang fights by assuming that they were made with Spirit Ash summons in mind, but I don't think that's a good argument anymore. especially with Valiant Gargoyles where your brain-dead summon will just stand in the poison and die immediately. You can't design bosses around poorly functioning AI that's outside the player's control, so I'm just gonna ignore Spirit Ashes for this rating. As a 2 versus 1, it's utter dog shit. And as a poor nod to Dark Souls, I guess, they wanted the Gargoyles to do area denial from time to time, but instead of the Flame Spray in Bell Gargoyles, they use poison. Problem with the poison is how not only does it do instant contact damage, a lot of it, on top of the damage over time effect, but it's kind of hard to see, has ridiculous range and makes the one spewing the poison unable to be hit in melee range for a while, because its area of effect extends behind the gargoyle. So there's no counterplay to it, it's just there to waste time, and these two are way too big, mobile and complex to be a balanced duo. And for such a long, intense fight, I'd rather have a real soundtrack instead of the mind-numbingly boring one they have. But I guess that does reflect my own state of boredom pretty accurately. Adir is the only boss here that I've fought a single time only, and the only final boss of a game, though for a while I did consider Arkham Asylum's Titan Joker. That fight is shit! But Adir has really set the new Brown standard for endgame bosses. I don't think you can end a game worse than this. It's basically Deacons of the Deep with Adir as just background noise. Instead of the fight having anything to do with this massive imprisoned god, you know, the name of this boss, you just fight skinny old dudes who feel like a more annoying version of a lot of the fodder enemies in this game. They're clearly designed to drag out the fight as much as possible with their fire circles on the ground that are there to limit your access to their melee range. Maybe if you really like listening to this guy talk, you won't mind that, but I just couldn't be bothered and started to tank the damage because I just wanted to be rid of the fight. For lore nerds, I'm sure you get something out of value out of this encounter, but as a boss fight, and the final one at that, it was a huge letdown, even for Lords of the Fallen standards. Great Centipede is anything but great, and works nothing like a centipede. Unlike most fights on this list, this boss is actually very easy. Usually I hate hard bad bosses more than easy bad bosses, because at least you can just mindlessly kill them and forget about them. But here I am 7 years later remembering how utterly terrible this fight was. Essentially this boss has 2 attacks. If you're at the front of the boss, it will do a delayed attack that can be either paralysis, poison, a boulder, or a head slam. Doesn't really matter which he picks because they all have the same timing pretty much. But if you're behind the boss, the centipede will just go through his own fucking body while trying to nibble at you, which can easily be stopped by just blocking. Upon doing damage to the centipede's body, the individual parts of it will scramble and try to spread around the arena, or fall through the floor. If successful, they will fill the whole place with poison, which can be cleared out with this air filtration machine. Though it's really hard to tell if the room is actually full of poison gas, because they chose to make the entire area look green and foggy. And phase 2? No phase 2, he just resets the fight by reassembling his body. This fight is so bad, I feel it's not even half finished. It makes Zhang Rang and Lady Osakabe look like masterpieces in comparison. At least those fights have animations that make sense. They don't emerge out of their own asses. Out of all the terrible gang fights mentioned, is it any surprise Dark Souls 2 ends up topping them all? Well, obviously not as bad as Frigid Outskirts, it should be noted that the run back to this boss is still one of the all-time worsts. And your reward is even worse. More like a punishment. This is 3 player model enemies in a shitty little cave, wearing weapons and armor of pre-established characters for whatever reason. Dark Souls 2 is all about methodical animation commitment. However, when there are 3 aggressive targets, you can hardly ever find the time to be able to safely commit to any other action than running away. These guys are poiseful bastards as well, so switching from heavy weapons that require long animation commitments to quicker ones won't really save the day, as now you'll just exchange damage and it's rarely worth the trade-off. And if you thought having multiple levels to the arena would make it easier, well, it doesn't really, because the entire bottom level should be stayed away from because the water there slows you down, and the petrifying statues, well, petrify you. So there's actually very little space for fighting these guys. I'm sure there are plenty of easy ways to cheese them, I'm sure you can parry and backstab them to death, but if that's the only way to make it bearable, is it really anything other than garbage? I mean, what do you get out of this? You paid for this fight. You spent time clearing out the area to get here. You got scammed! Now, before number 1, I wanna name some runner-ups. Some of them I already mentioned, but I will again. Joker from Arkham Asylum. Stupid ass fight. Leechmonger from Demon Souls. What a shit show. Royal Red Authority from Dark Souls 2. wet fart of a boss, as well as bosses who can hardly be counted as bosses, especially in Elden Ring. And finally, Zhang Rang, who also narrowly dodged the boss Hall of Infamy due to the lightning bolt spam being removed from the game in an update. The OG fight would be top 5 worst bosses material. Now let's get to the obvious number 1. Sorry to be unoriginal, but I'm not gonna swap Bed of Chaos out for something else just to be unique, when this is just how it is. Oh shit, now I'm a DMod clone, I guess. Shit, this must mean I have bad takes now. Anyway, in case you didn't know, Bed of Chaos has 2 weak spots you need to hit, one on the left and the right corner of the room. Once you've destroyed one, the floor begins to crumble underneath your feet, and the real challenge begins, which is the bed monster trying to swat you down into the newly opened chasms. It doesn't help those hand swipes pretty much ignore iframes, and physics by always pulling you towards the holes, even if that's not the direction the hand was pushing you in. Once both weak spots are destroyed, you need to jump down onto a branch underneath the bed. Only you have to keep in mind that goddamn landing roll your character will automatically do against your will, which more often than not ends up killing you. And then you just one-shot the boss from within, and there you go, fuck you. This is a monumental failure on every level. Besides lore being good, which isn't done any justice here. Adir was bad, but at least the lore does come into play there, since he's vomiting it all over you. This is an insult to the lore of the Witch of Izalith, and the players that are forced to kill it. The notorious rushed development of Dark Souls doesn't justify this at all in my opinion. They could have, at any point, added a bonfire before the boss, at the very least. It's not like they weren't allowed to touch the game after launch, they even made a DLC. So why not even attempt to fix this shit? Or at least lessen it. I know there are lots of cheese methods to get past this, but it shouldn't have to be the go-to strategy. The intended way shouldn't have to be the absolute worst boss ever made. And there you have it, that's my list. Obviously I don't have the most varied of lists here, but I generally only play good games. And Lords of the Fallen, Wo Long and Neo, but mostly good games. Good games rarely have something as bad as this. If I were to explore the deepest, darkest corners of indie games and cheap games, I'm sure there's plenty worse out there that's literally unplayable. But until I lose my mind and seek one out, I doubt Bed of Chaos will be topped. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Enlisted. Once again, link in the description and pinned comment. And, maybe I'll do something like top 10 ganks or favorite video games next. Let me know what you want.